Hello, Matt. Welcome to the Transformational Learning Summit.
Great to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited about this conversation, um, mostly because I'm really inspired by the way that you've created a really impressive career in academia around flourishing, and that you speak about topics like love with such depth and eloquence in an industry that isn't necessarily known for such topics. And I'd love to start the conversation by inviting you to share a little bit about your journey into flourishing. Like, what brought you into this path, and how did this become a thing for you in academia?
Well, thank you. And we should define a little bit because I can talk
Mm.
for an hour just on that. So maybe 2 minutes, something to that effect.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Okay. So my first role in academia was as a criminologist. My PhD's in sociology and my research focused largely on criminal violence.
Mm.
And I found that topic interesting. I feel like I made some contributions, but as Nietzsche says, when you look into the abyss looks into you. And
Mm.
so I started to feel like it wasn't good for me. And so I started to include, I had a course, an undergraduate course on the sociology of law. And I started to include a day in the semester. Um, in the syllabus, it was titled um, Law, What Does Love Have to Do with It? Sort of, riffing on the Tina Turner song a bit. And the students liked it. And so the next semester I did a couple days on that and then 2 weeks. And so I just kept expanding it. And pretty soon, I mean, this is the short version. Pretty soon I stopped teaching sociology of law and started teaching sociology of love. And so the way into it in the legal realm is through something like restorative justice or transformational justice.
Mm.
And then more broadly, we started inquiring about what a loving way of being would look like at the individual level, at the organizational level, at the societal and global level. And so the course just continued to grow and to be shaped by students. I tried to give students the ability to co-create parts of it. And then eventually I shifted that course from sociology of love to a course that I called Love in Action, where most of the course was not in a classroom or behind a computer, but out doing things in the world to try to have these little experiments with loving ways of relating to the world. And then students would come back and really create the course. So there was opportunity for contemplative reflection, both through private journaling, then also through sharing parts of the journal with another student, and then the student offering some greater understanding into some of the dynamics of living in a loving way and in a world that's often unloving. And so we just kept growing the focus on the positive. And so gradually my research started to incorporate restorative justice and other kinds of intentions. Rather than just sort of understanding why people do bad things, we start understanding what can we do to make it right? What can we do to start healing
Mm.
some of the harms? And then what can we do to create a world where we don't have to harm each other in the first place? So sociology of law, sociology of love, love in action. And then finally, towards the end of that part of my career, I just renamed it the meaning of life. And we taught some of those sections of that class as what many of us at the time were calling unclasses. So we looked at the ways in which our own pedagogical practice was dehumanizing us and dehumanizing students, and we just decided to do the opposite of everything we had been trained to do. So
Mm.
instead of showing up with a syllabus, we show up empty-handed and say to the students, you are going to co-create the syllabus with me over the course of the semester. And instead of staying in a classroom, we would often leave the classroom and be in the community. And so instead of having a final exam or something, we would find creative ways to enable people to share what they wanted to share in a format that aligned with their deepest aspirations for their lives. And so, this kind of creation part of Bloom's taxonomy, rather than the kind of memorization and regurgitation at the lower level. So it was all part of a journey that I would say is co-created with colleagues, with friends, with family members, and with students. And we all start to get curious about whether we can live in a loving manner in a world of abundance, or whether we're stuck with this kind of violent competitiveness that is premised on scarcity and zero-sum ways of being. So anyway, that's probably more than 2 minutes, but it's a start, I guess.
It feels so situated in what we're talking about as far as transformational learning and the possibility of transforming the world, though, in the sense of the extent to which how we learn goes on to shape how we show up in the world, goes on to shape how the world responds to us and the conditions of the world. So I'm fascinated by this concept of the unclass, because it feels so unconventional. And I'm also curious about how what was the relationship between you and any expectation that the university might have of grades or outcomes or things like that. Like how were you able to kind of shape this unconventional learning experience within the parameters of an institutional framework?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think we were blessed and cursed simultaneously. The curse was at the university, there was a terrible budget crisis that had been decades or maybe a century in the making. I'm not sure, but there was a lot of conflict and friction and a lot of contraction of programs, and eventually tenured faculty were fired, which is very rare in academia. So there was a lot of sense that the sky was falling, and in that context, we could get away with things. So there was an experiential learning center that was created as kind of a space for innovative practice. And so really good-hearted people and really smart people showed up in the midst of the sky falling, and started to form these trusting friendships that enabled us to take some risks. And I think the institution could appreciate at some level, maybe not what we were doing, but that there was some vitality there at a time when there was a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth. And so we were given some flexibility we might not otherwise have had. And mainly we just didn't ask for permission for a lot of things. We just, occasionally had to ask for forgiveness, but not often, because the students liked it. And so, I guess what I would say is that we sometimes failed, and we weren't punished for the failures. But in my experience, I don't think we have to worry so much about the free rider problem when we are empowering people to live into their best selves and to become more generous and to care about their fellow peers in the class, and to care about the topic, and to care about their own growth and development. I don't know that we really need exams and other kinds of ways of checking in to make sure that they're not turning into free riders. So I wouldn't say that was always the case, but I would say that in my experience, it was often the case that
Mm,
if we create a container where we're opening space for human beings to become a little bit more of their, what they might aspire to become, their best self, then you don't have to kind of punitively check in on whether they're doing that work. You can tell from the way they show up, the energy that they bring. And we would often use these contemplative practices like contemplative journaling. And I think that's where the real learning took place. So what it underscored for me is that I don't need to give a lot of lectures. That's that can be entertaining. I went through a system where I mostly sat there and listened to lectures. And then
mhm,
you get into the senior classes, you have some seminars where there's a little bit of dialogue. But largely it's a passive experience. When you create an active experience, especially in a class like Love in Action or The Meaning of Life, um, there's not a formal curriculum that you have to cover so that they can take an exam that's designed by the department for all of the sections. Like this was one section, there were no other sections. So I
mhm,
think I think it was a privileged place to be, again, while the world was collapsing around us. And so my feeling is that we didn't get into a lot of trouble because the students were our co-pilots, and administrators don't want to get in the way of what students want.
mm, mm,
So it was kind of like we offer um, a path, and then the students get way out in front, and we're just trying to catch up. So that's easier than dragging people along, and that's what felt different about the unclasses. That earlier in my career, I was often feeling like I was trying to drag students along, and using these methods that I had learned, that I had
mm.
internalized, because that's all I knew. And so in this moment of creative destruction, we had some fresh thinking.
Mm, mm. What you described there as students caring about their learning experience, caring about each other, having a sense of agency, like that to me, becoming their best selves, that to me feels like flourishing. And I'd
Yeah.
love to maybe get a more technical definition from you as well. But um, what's what in your experience would you say are the building blocks of an experience like that? You mentioned contemplative journaling, but I'm wondering also in the context of you are teaching a course called Love in Action or The Meaning of Life, so it lends itself to that kind of maybe contemplative, almost spiritual orientation. But what would you say are the building blocks of an experience like that that potentially could be applied to a subject matter that's not related to self and other in such an explicit way, like learning medicine or mathematics or something.
Yeah.
What is the basis of creating an experience where students begin to have that territory open up for them?
Well, I think about my own experience as an undergraduate with the course College Algebra. And
That's a
this
good
was a
one.
this was a course where there were 100 sections, and the midterm and the final exam would be created by the department. So you hope that the instructor that you were assigned to would cover what's on that exam. And in my case, the person didn't. And so I was very unprepared. And in fact, the instructor walked in the first day and complained that his primary discipline was physics, and there wasn't a course for him that semester, so he'd been reassigned to teach college algebra, which he hated, and he demonstrated his hatred of the topic. So I think when I started, there were about 50 of us. When I dropped the class in the middle of the semester, there were about 12 of us left.
Mm,
So that's an example of um, a kind of process that dishonors and dehumanizes.
mhm,
And so what we're suggesting, even in a class like college algebra, maybe there's a standard curriculum, but the question is, why are we doing it? Well, in the service of what? So if we can begin to understand what our purpose is, and if flourishing is the North Star, then we can say, oh, we need algebra in order to develop the kind of creative capacities that human beings need to build a better world, because algebra fits into that in this way. And we better be able to say how that works. I mean,
Mhm.
personally, there's a wonderful book that I would recommend to everyone, um, titled Mathematics for Human Flourishing. And it makes the point that mathematics, like everything else, either serves flourishing or it falls short of its loftiest aspirations. And so it's a beautiful book about why mathematics is so important to human flourishing and why everyone should have some ability to reason quantitatively and to use the tools of mathematics, even if you're not going to become someone who teaches math, or necessarily your career uses it a lot. It's just a very compelling book about why mathematics serves human flourishing at its best, when it's at its best. So I think that there's an opportunity that we have to explain to students, how does this particular course connect with a deeper shared purpose that is meaningful, that you can understand the way that the pieces fit together. And I don't know that educational systems do that very well. It certainly was not apparent to me,
Mm.
in my experience. So what I've tried to do in many of the shifts that I wouldn't say that I have made, but the shifts that have been cultivated by caring people, and then I participate in that to some extent, is to learn from my dissatisfaction. Why am I dissatisfied? Oh, this is dehumanizing. Oh, this is not in the service of some noble purpose that matters. If we live an average lifespan, we get about 3 billion heartbeats. So why am I wasting, several thousand heartbeats on this endeavor that is completely misaligned with the North Star of flourishing? So that's been the discovery. And one of the things that was, so helpful for me was to realize that what I was doing connected to a holistic framework that people are calling flourishing now. So I was focused later in my career, after the criminology phase, on the relationship between religious and spiritual experience and benevolent service to others. And I was really focused on a few of the domains of flourishing: meaning and purpose, close social relationships. But then when I started connecting with people like Tyler Vanderweel, who founded the Human Flourishing program at Harvard, and seeing these more holistic and integrated frameworks, I thought, oh, well, what am I leaving out in my own life as I search for meaning and purpose? Maybe there can be more room for happiness and life satisfaction. Maybe bring some joy into that. So I started seeing all of these domains as being either in harmony, or we're making trade-offs. And then the question is, why are we forced to make trade-offs? Why can't we have some level of all of these domains in a way that actually one domain enhances the other? So I started seeing the complete picture, and really desiring that in my own life and wanting to share that with others. So that's why we started a community of practice at Harvard that became the Flourishing Network, where we took a motto from another school called Cowell College at UC Santa Cruz, and the motto is the pursuit of truth in the company of friends. Why
Mm.
can't we live like that instead of being in competition? I remember being in classes, I often felt like, the professor's time was very scarce, a scarce commodity, and we had to sort of compete with each other to get that.
Mhm.
And, when you're in a class of 1,000 students, that is, in fact, the case. So why do we organize education that way? Why do we have the sage on the stage? Well, it's cheap and it's efficient, but it's not in the service of flourishing. So it's efficient in the service of the wrong goal, which means it's inefficient
Mm.
in light of the polycrisis that afflicts the world, and that we have an opportunity to address if we understand that the goal of education, or a goal of education in part, is to begin to address this polycrisis so that we can have flourishing for all people, all living things, and for the life-sustaining systems of the planet that are threatened at the
Mm.
moment.
So when you convene a learning experience, and so you establish this why, is that the establishment of that why, is that a conversational process usually? Is that something that is co-created? Because I imagine that one of the shifts in what we're talking about is this is really blurring the line between professor or teacher or instructor and participant in a way that also invites the participant to really contribute some amount of content into the space. So I like, there's that why piece and how that works, and then what might be some other components of a learning experience, that like an unlearning experience in this way.
Yeah, unlearning. That's wonderful. I think that's right. We all have different gifts. I enjoy reading outside of my discipline. So, criminology, sociology, that's just a kind of container that where I often have found myself, but I go beyond that. And so I love to read in the humanities. So now I've sort of moved on. My title now is professor of the social sciences and humanities, to kind of reflect that. So I love to bring to students some wisdom from the traditions of indigenous groups, organized religions, philosophical systems, and I guess what I would say, from groups that are outside of my discipline of training and my discipline of specialization. And so I share that with students, and then I invite them to respond to it, because in some sense there are some universals. Most people, I think, maybe not all, but nearly all people want to become better people. What does that mean, though, in a postmodern moment? And so we explore that. And so what anchors do we have? What safe space, transitional space, as the child psychiatrists talk about it, do we have, so that we can have some kind of attachment, but then go out and explore this unfamiliar terrain, but then come back into the loving arms of the parent who's waiting for us. And so I think that, human beings have been grappling with this for thousands of years, and we've produced an amazing body of diverse viewpoints, but pointing to similar kinds of things. Like we all want to help each other. We all want to love each other more fully into being. Well, again, I say we all, but nearly all of us, I think, want that. And so how do we create institutional logics where that can become more likely rather than less likely? And so I would bring in, some great text about loving one's enemies. What does this have to do with the sociology of law? Well, it has everything to do with it. So let's bring that in, and then let's all offer our own gifts into that conversation. And so it was a process of just getting comfortable with letting go of the reins a bit, so that others could co-create. And I think that I've probably I can say this without any hyperbole. I've learned a lot more from students than they've learned from me. Because I've had hundreds and hundreds of teachers. And so I feel like I remember, I'll tell one quick story. There was a computer science student, and he signed up for an honors class I was teaching, and it happened to be called The Meaning of Life at that point. And he didn't know, other than it was a required, there's an honors colloquium, you have to take them if you're honor students. He just knew that it started at noon. He had an hour at noon in his busy computer science schedule. So he showed up and got the syllabus, and he saw the title, Meaning of Life. And he said it at the end of the semester to the class in his final presentation. When I saw that title, thought it was the dumbest thing I'd ever seen. Like, why, who gives you the right to tell me what the meaning of life is or whatever? Of course, that's not what the class was about. It was about the search for meaning, and how do we search individually? How do we search collectively? How do we help each other find greater depth and meaning in our lives? And then how do we create these social containers where others can find greater meaning? So he said, this struck me as the wrong thing at the beginning of the semester, and by the end, he was partnering with, this was one of these unclasses, so he was partnering with a nonprofit to help them. They didn't have any ability to have website development or support to build databases, et cetera. So he's using his computer science skills to help a group whose mission he believes in to become more effective at their mission. And he said, this is really meaningful. And so I like coding, as a computer science student, but I would rather code for a purpose. And now it's not just making money or making some interesting video game or something, but it's actually helping a group that I care about do work that I care that it gets done. So, he said at the end that, now I would love for all computer science students at this university to have that experience. So I've been talking with the department about whether the senior project could be in the service of a nonprofit that can't afford the kinds of things that, for-profit companies have, a large staff to do. And so we could enhance the social fabric in the city and in the surrounding region if we deployed our skills in serving these underserved nonprofits. And it would be meaningful for students. They would have something that looks nice on a resume, and it would serve the world. So that's the win-win-win. That's ikigai in the kind of Japanese framework. So, I would say those kinds of awakenings, to what's possible and to the abundance that we have in our world, if we would organize differently, if we would organize for purpose, and if we would organize for service, above all, I think that there's just unlimited energy within students to become part of that. And instead, we close all of that down and say, here's your assignment, and do the conventional thing that that really is not preparing you to be a leader. And I like to make the distinction between a management function and a leadership function. And the management function, as I see it, is really, this is what this group is doing, this organization or community. They're already doing this thing, and they've got a certain level of meaning and a certain level of impact. And my job is to grow that by like 1%, but it's still mostly just reproducing. And the leadership function says, well, how can we unlock vitality so that we can get people in touch with the abundance that this current process is not helping them to see and to connect with? And so I think that there's an opportunity for us in educational spaces, especially with students at universities, and I would say even earlier than that, to give them a dose of the leadership function rather than just training the next group of managers or people who will be obedient to managers, which is what some programs that I've been involved with seem to be doing. So we invite people to step out of the container and say what's missing and how do we co-create a process that would allow us to unlock this vibrancy and this sense of abundance so that we can actually create what the world so desperately needs.
What I'm hearing is an emphasis on the participants agency and their in an adaptive way. And you also use the words letting go, in the context of how the learning experience is structured. So I'm curious to first explore that side of really I guess the scariness of that, because I think it can be I may imagine that as a instructor, it can be scary to let that go, but also how, in your experience, you might balance um, the aspiration to cover a certain body of content in the context of an experience that might end up being highly emergent, or somehow go in a different direction, or somehow, because of the richness of what emerges, you might not be able to cover all that content. How do you,
Mm.
in your experience, how do you balance all of those factors between giving genuine agency to your participants, to your students, and at the same time, some form of structure that ensures that the right stuff is covered?
How much time do we have left?
Right, right. Yeah, I
I'll
get
try. I'll
it.
try to do 5 minutes on that. That's beautiful. Let me see how to proceed. So I used to use an article. I'm not teaching at present. That's why I say I used to use. I'm so busy with research that I haven't been teaching lately. But when I was teaching, I would use this article by Donna Hicks on the essential work of either honoring dignity in organizations, or the leadership calamity that will befall an organization if you dishonor human dignity. So dignity is different than earning respect. Dignity is sort of inherent. We all have infinite worth. And if we are dishonored at the core of our being, then there will be problems in organizations. And a lot of problems that we see relate to dignity, what Donna calls dignity violations. So I assigned this article of a case study of an organization that essentially collapses because the leaders can't appreciate the importance of honoring human dignity. And it's a great article, and I assign it, we talk about it, and move on. Well, one semester at Harvard, there was a group called the Bureau of Study Council that had been at Harvard for like 7 decades, and then was the administration decided not to keep that group going. But one of the last encounters I had with them before they were closed down, they gave me a deck of cards. I forget. I think it was called I forget the name of the deck. But on each card, there's an image, and it might be a cat playing. It might be a candle in the darkness. It might be a B+ grade on a paper. It might be a blank card. So there's 700 of these things. And the point is, you spread these out on a table. I didn't spread all 700 out. I had like 30 students or something. And I invited students to pick one card that spoke to them, and not to analyze it too much, but just, take a card that resonates. And so students, took a card, and they sat down, and we were going to talk about dignity and the importance of dignity for leadership and flourishing and all the rest. And I had assigned Donna's article that day. And some of the students became quite emotional just contemplating this image on this card. And so it felt like we had to pivot. So we have, we have content that we must cover, Donna's article, but there's something coming up with the lived experience of dignity in this classroom. And so I remember just inviting some students to share about, what was coming up for them, and because of the contemplating the image in this card. So there's something about the image that helped them access a part of themselves that the written journaling had not up to that point in the semester. Maybe because we paired it with the dignity article. And it led to this really wonderful, I know I'm probably over my 5 minutes, so I'll just sum it up.
Don't worry
It
about it.
led
No,
to this,
keep going. This is rich.
it led to this really wonderful conversation about the meaning of dignity, versus earning respect, inherent dignity versus like what you have to earn, and their experience. And many of them are, in some sense, world leaders already at their young age. That's how they got into Harvard.
Mm.
They've achieved at a level that is sometimes hard to fathom. And I think, I mean, I'm going to draw an inference here, but I think that many of them were probably first in their class in high school. And then they get to Harvard where like everybody's first in the class. So you go from being like special to being average in a sense. And so you're not earning respect relative to your peers the way you did. So that's why, we started talking about inherent unearned dignity. And it felt to me that many of the students had emphasized in their lives earning respect and had not been in touch with their own inherent dignity. So this was just sort of an intuition that I had. And again, because of the emotional nature of how they were reacting to the conversation and to the card. And so I just decided to stop and say to each student, you have inherent dignity, and just sort of make eye contact and do that. And and several students broke down in tears,
Mm.
during this moment. And it might be the first time that anyone had said that in that way, in that kind of a container. So we had created a place of trust through the way that we had related to each other and students relating to each other over the course of the semester, where something like that could happen. So by the end of the semester, most of the students focused their final paper on dignity.
Mm.
So that was not a lecture, that was not the plan going in, but that was the teachable moment where something bigger than any of us was emerging collectively in the experience that was unlocked by the beautiful work that this group of people at the Bureau of Study Council had been doing with students, for many decades. And so offering a kind of, loving, open, contemplative space. I don't know that we actually talked about the article directly that day,
Mm.
but it informed everything that happened. But there were other things informing it as well. And so there was this kind of spontaneous, I think it was Parker Palmer who talks about the grace of great things, maybe in his book, The Courage to Teach. And what he means by that is that we keep rediscovering in countless university classes and other educational settings that you're never going to move too far away from something like justice. It always comes back. Whatever you're taught, you're going to come back to something like justice because it's universally desired and it's such an important part of life, and yet it remains elusive. There's a kind of like mystery here, like we're searching for justice and we create all these structures and then we don't get the justice that we want. So what went wrong? Then we recreate the structures, then we start to transform institutions, and somehow it's still elusive. So there's something outside of our grasp, but we continue to desire it. So that's the great thing. In
Mm.
sociology, it's social structure that we can't always see. But once we start to get a glimpse of how social structure is affecting individual behavior, then we start to want to understand that, but it remains somewhat elusive. And so I think that there was an experience of the grace of great things in that classroom, and that embedded the construct, the academic construct of inherent dignity more deeply in the students than had I just given a lecture on that.
Mm.
So I think that we covered more than the required content that day. That's the way I like
Mm.
to say it. It's like, yes, we have things like I have a responsibility as an instructor in a course to make sure that learning occurs, but I'm always aiming for more than what's required.
Mm, mm,
And the only way to get more than what's required is if we are all teachers. I could tell stories all day about this,
mm,
but the agency of students is a big part of that. But it's not just any kind of agency. It's an agency that emerges when students start to really care about each other as human beings. So again, pursuit of truth in the company of friends, and that is a shared intention that can be honored or dishonored. But when you start to understand at the core of your being what inherent dignity is and how that has not been honored, then you start to want to create spaces where we honor that more fully. And in that way, human beings can love each other more fully into being. This is the Ubuntu kind of idea that a person becomes a person through other persons. And
mm,
that's the powerful um, transformative education process when that
mhm.
starts to happen. And then you do more than what's required.
I
Even
love.
if you don't cover everything that's on the syllabus. So, sometimes I would cut a week or two off at the end because we spent so much time on this deep dive. I didn't get to this other thing. Is the world better or worse because I failed to cover those last two readings on the syllabus? I would argue, and I would allow my students to argue, the world is better for it.
Mm, mm. And I love the demonstration of transformation in many dimensions here, because one, it's just transforming the nature of what exactly is being learned, but the other side of that, and this is the definition of transformation that we work with, which is that transformation is something that becomes available in a space where people become deeply present to themselves and each other,
Yeah.
and the many layers of that presence. And so when you have an experience like that, where there's something deeply present for people in this territory between inherent dignity and earned respect, and there's an opportunity for that to surface as a lived experience that can then be witnessed by the other students, that's transformational. It becomes something that's a source of transformation and becomes deeply embedded in who they are and who they become. But
Mm, mm.
I wonder about I think this territory that um, is maybe at the edge of this, and something that I'm really hearing you allude to in one way or another, is the quality of intimacy, love, and connection between students. And that's something in a world of education that's focused on content. This is about the transfer of my knowledge from my head into your head. There isn't as much emphasis or value on these things. And what you're talking about ultimately, especially in that example, is where students actually get intimate with each other. And sometimes some would say that's not appropriate. That's not what this context is for. If you want that, go find a therapist. So I and in its own way, it becomes the deepest form of healing and therapy to be in a
Yeah,
space
yeah,
of inquiry with other people at this deep human level that's not just about content. So I'd love to
yeah.
hear you speak about that a little bit.
Well, I think it's beautiful. I think what you described in terms of transformation. There's a book I read some years ago by Ken Bain. I think it was called "What the Best Professors Do,"
Mm,
and they do just what you described. It's not that we're giving students answers; we're giving them questions and letting them search for answers. And that's this
mm,
possibility um, of real learning because you're empowered to inquire. And then you're trying to, somebody said, and I forget who it was, that the best way to understand a system is to change it. And so you
mm,
start changing systems and seeing how they respond, and then you start to really learn more deeply. And again, it's always a bit out of reach. You don't ever quite, fully get there. So when we think about what the best professors do, they're creating a space in which people can grapple with questions that remain a bit elusive. And I think you engage in that endeavor um, more effectively when you know that there's a role for your love to make a difference in the world, and that other people are loving you into being.
Mm.
So it's a give and take process, but I use the word love to describe it. I think it's the right one. And
How would you define love? I just want to pause there for a second.
yeah,
Do you have a technical definition for love?
well, theologians have said you can't define it because it's the highest value. So
Mm,
anything, any word you would use to sort of explain or define what love is going to diminish it in some way. So
hmm
I will start with that, but then say that there's a popular book by Bell Hooks called All About Love: New Visions, and she draws on some collective wisdom when she says it would be better if we started using love as a verb rather than a noun. I mean, it's easy for people to sort of get infatuated with each other and become jealous and then violent. That's not what we mean by love. That's
hmm
sort of Romeo and Juliet both ending up dead, at the end of the drama. So there are strong feelings, but in the psychiatry and psychology world, we would call investing strong feelings in other people cathexis. And cathexis can serve love, or cathexis can get in the way of love. As a criminologist, I can tell you that murder suicide is not love. There's strong feelings, but you're not ultimately nurturing your own good and the good of the beloved. And
hmm
so love is really about nurturing the deepest forms of growth of yourself and of the other that you love. And if you love a community, nurturing the flourishing of the community. If you love the planet, working so that the planet can become healthier and more vibrant. So love is really about, in its verb form, is really about nurturing growth. And then when we do that, we feel good. You get the
hmm
helper's high or whatever, because you know that you haven't destroyed, you've created, you've co-created. So, when I think about a book like All About Love, offering language like, to love is to nurture the spiritual growth of self and other, some kind of language like that. What does spiritual mean? It means that we're in deepest communion with each other. So,
hmm
Thomas Aquinas would talk about a love that wills the good of the other.
hmm
So, we want to be in union in a healthy way somehow with the beloved, and we want to help them flourish. We want to help them become their best possible self. So for some people, that rises to the level of spirituality or sacredness. And when you think about Martin Buber's I and thou, how do you relate to another person as if they were just had as much sacred value as you yourself have? That's kind of I and thou. But when you're using them as an object, that's I and it. And so, when you're using others for your own ends, that's not love. It's a kind of extraction or transaction. But when you genuinely care about the other for their own sake, as a friend of mine, Stephen Post, puts it, in the giving of self lies the unsought discovery of a better self. So you give yourself to
hmm
this other person, and then you discover that in giving you grow. And so it's this seeming paradox. It's not really a paradox. It's sort of ontologically what we were created to become. And so you discover that through the encounter with the sacred thou, the beloved, as a being of infinite worth, a being that you can help love more fully into being, and they can do the same for you. So, in how does that work in the classroom? I mean, it seems several orders of magnitude removed from what we're doing. In fact, this is what the best professors do. I think I could add a chapter to Ken Bain's book and say these award-winning, beloved professors, students go back and visit them 10 years later and say what a difference they've made in their lives. They genuinely love their students and they genuinely love their topics. And they don't see they don't see a world of answers. They see a world of questions. And what a joy it is to explore these questions with capable, creative co-hosts, students are able to enhance the exploration of these questions that we all care about. And in those kinds of containers, we express genuine care. We may never use the word love. We could use caritas or agape or something else. If the word love is uncomfortable, there's a company called Barry Waymiller Incorporated, which owns about 120 or so subsidiaries. Many of them are factories, and they use the word care, and they say, we're trying to create spaces where people can care about each other. And our product is the well-being of everybody on our team and everybody that we serve. And so we create these spaces where we learn how to care about each other more effectively, practically, with practical wisdom. And then we find that our profit margins go way up because we're not dealing with what other companies are dealing with, where they've dehumanized people. And there's all sorts of sabotage and disengagement. I mean, Gallup surveys find that most workers are not engaged in what they're doing, and many are actively disengaged. They're trying to sabotage what the organization wants. So how do you begin to teach people to care for each other? The first step is to help them acquire the skills that are needed to really listen, to really understand. And so I'm doing all this talking, I'm a bad example right now of this, but to really stop and listen long enough to care about what the other person is saying, so that you can begin to understand and then respond effectively. So they work on listening skills, among other things. And so they would say, we're going to use the word care because sometimes in a business context, love can feel uncomfortable or has too much baggage. And I say, okay, that's fine. I understand what you're saying. When you say the word care, I hear the word love, and that's okay. So it's necessary, as it is saying, I think it was attributed to St. Francis. I'm not sure he actually said it, but preach the gospel at all times and use words when necessary.
I love that. And I think it's funny that if you really think about it, if you really step back from social norms and the way what language is or isn't appropriate, and you ask yourself, what is the purpose of a classroom or an educational experience? You would say it is to nurture the highest potential of the participant, undoubtedly. So I love this definition of love as being in service to that, in service of the wholeness and full potential of a person. And it just seems obvious in that sense, like, yeah, that's what it should be.
Well, and one of the challenges we have is that the word love has been so misused and confused. And so, that's part of our educational journey as well, is to really clarify words so that we can communicate effectively. Just sharing information is not necessarily communication, but the only way to communicate effectively is to invite people to have an encounter with the great thing that you're trying to learn about. So, in my courses, it would be flourishing or love or previously law, something like law. I mean, law is a great thing. It's always a little bit elusive. But as one law professor put it, in heaven, there will be no law, and the lion will lie down with the lamb. In hell, there will be nothing but law, and due process will be meticulously observed. So we're sort of stuck with legal processes because we're not, we haven't figured out how to create heaven on earth. But it's important. Like, these processes are important because they can be more loving or less loving, but we can't seem to escape the need for them as we continue to recreate the experience of scarcity and dignity violation and I and it and all all the rest. So until it's a world of I and thou, We need law as a tool, but law can be hell on earth, depending
Mm.
on whether it's infused with love. So I dream of a world where we don't need law and friendship prevails. And until then, let's make law more loving. It's kind of, and that's the transformational journey. And I think we know where we want to go. We're not there yet, but let's use the structures we have so that people can love each other more fully into being, in the best sense of the word love. But we have to communicate, what that means.
Mm. What are your thoughts on the internal condition of the instructor, the importance of, what's going on with them internally, their relationship to themselves, how they might in the moment show up in a classroom, how maybe you might prepare yourself to show up as in your best self, most in service of the participants in the experience.
Well, as one teacher put it, he said, "My upset became my setup." And so when you think about burnout, which is so pervasive across so many sectors, the upset has not become the setup. The upset is just the upset. And so you find ways to cope with that. And so the things that I didn't like about being a student, I tried to change when I had a little bit more um, authority and to do so. And I remember making some changes and kind of looking over my shoulder, like, what's going to happen? Is something bad going to happen? And nothing bad happened. Like, only good things happened. So I'd make more changes. And again, if these are collaborative changes, I think you can get away with quite a lot. If you're just imposing something on an unwilling group of people, then you probably will get into some trouble. So collaboration is the way to go. But my upset became my setup, to change, and not okay. I've given up on this. I'm going to focus on my life outside of my vocation, and when I go to work, I'm just going to put in my time, so to speak. There's a lot of people who've made that kind of shift, and so I had people loving me more fully into being who wouldn't let me do that. And so then you start to say, well, what's necessary? Do I need to read more books, or do I need more technical skill, or do I need to take a course on um, pedagogy or something? You go back to school for education courses. I never had any education courses. So this was all sort of self-taught or learned in collaboration with others. But you don't really need any of that. I remember uh, working as a volunteer for a restorative justice center, and we had a grant to bring in an expert to train us on how to do restorative justice more effectively. And so restorative justice is not about, for the listeners, is not about punishment. It's about making things right. It's about active responsibility. So there could be a punishment imposed by a court system, but there could also be a process parallel or independent of that to try to make things as right as possible. And so restorative justice groups help with that process. And so this expert comes in and gives us a big binder of material. And he sort of slams it on the table in front of us. There's about 10 of us, and bang, bang, bang. And we're looking at all this content, and we think, wow, 2 days to go through this huge binder. That's going to be interesting. What a, drinking from the fire hose experience that will be. And he says, okay, I want you to engage in a ritual with me. Take the big binder and put it under the desk, on the floor, so you can't see it. And so we sort of did that. And he said, this is the most important step you can take to doing restorative justice more effectively, is set all the content aside. I mean, he's being a bit facetious here, but it was great fun. And he said, so we're going to do some deep belly breathing to relax ourselves, to calm ourselves, to ground ourselves. And that is actually the most important thing, most important practice you can engage in to do restorative justice, is to quiet yourself, to calm yourself, to ground yourself so that you can be fully present to what these two people, a victim and offender, are going to co-create together. And your job is really just to hold space for that. And of course, there's a big binder full of content about what that means and how to do that and case studies and all the rest. And we'll crack that open later, but we're going to spend the first hour just with grounding exercises, because it's the energy you bring to that space, along with the preparation you've put into it with both parties, that's going to determine the effectiveness of this victim offender conference. And so I really took that to heart, that there's a kind of spirit that we access and bring with us into these encounters that that make them I and thou rather than I and it. And that's really essential. That's the foundation. And the other content, you have to have it. I mean, you know, we talk about the role of compassion in healthcare. You have to learn the biomedical stuff. You know, that's sort of, you know, important. But you know, that without compassion can be very harmful. And compassion without any knowledge about the biomedical aspects of healing is not going to be fully healing either. So you really need both of these things. But what comes first is really that spirit we bring to it, the sense of purpose and the inner grounding, so that we're not projecting you know, our troubles onto the process, but we have found a way to sit with our own discomfort and work with that creatively, so that we can be fully present to what other people need and not just always amygdala hijacked ourselves.
Matt, I want to be mindful of time and
Yeah.
just really thanking you for just sharing the depth of your wisdom. I feel like we could go on for hours down the different rabbit holes of this territory, because it's so rich and just so incredibly important with everything going on in the world today. Yeah,
Well, thank you for modeling such good listening. I feel like I've just been you know, grandstanding, but you asked such beautiful questions and then held such open space for me to offer something that really is collective. And I've just sort of noticed it over the years. I try to share the best of what my teachers, including hundreds of students, have helped me to learn.
Yeah, well, this was definitely the context of this particular space, was to invite you to share as much as possible of that. So deep power of gratitude. And yeah, thank you for your time.
And next time I'll be the listener and I'll just enjoy your wisdom.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.